Rolling on all devices and streaming to the channel.
Good afternoon and welcome. This is a special meeting of the City of Morro Bay City Council. It is Tuesday, September 22nd, 2020. It is 3:07 p.m. We apologize for the delay. We were having some technical difficulties. This meeting is being held via teleconference pursuant to Section 3 of Executive Order N29-20 issued by Governor Newsom on March 17th, 2020. This meeting will be conducted telephonically through Zoom and broadcast live on cable channel 20 and streamed on the city website. Please be advised that pursuant to the executive order and to ensure that the health and safety of the public by limiting human contact that could spread the COVID-19 virus, the Veterans Hall will not be open for this meeting. Thank you. With that, I will go ahead and note that we have established a quorum. I will call the meeting to order, and I will open up public comment for items on the agenda only. This is a special meeting. We do have 2 items, and if you would like to give public comment, the clerk will put the information on how to access Zoom via telephone or via the link, and you may do that. And please be sure to press the raise hand button or the appropriate phone raise hand buttons in order to be recognized. So with that, Zeke, do we have any public comment?
Chair, at this point, we do not have any raised hands.
Thank you.
Actually, Erica Crawford just raised her hands. Just a moment.
Fantastic.
Okay, Erica, you are live.
Hi there, thank you. And I'm sorry,
Welcome.
Hello, thank you. This is for public comment on the special meeting agenda, correct?
That is correct.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, Honorable Mayor and City Council. America with the Chamber. While we see the benefits and merits of the expansion of the utility discount program as proposed by city staff, we want to point out that the businesses are the hardest hit in this crisis. We request that you develop a program that would have similar benefits for the business community. This program could include an expansion and aggressive marketing of the utility rebates that pay for water-conserving fixtures. Such a program would be a win-win because in the end, we save water and our businesses save money on every water bill going forward. There is an opportunity here to help businesses save money and for the community to save water. Many of Morro Bay's businesses have seen their cost of doing business increase, both because of the extra costs of complying with COVID guidance and the increase in water and sewer rates. Many businesses still have had to dig into their personal savings every month to cover business expenses or to take business loans out to keep their lights on. These people are on a fluid, not fixed income, and they are seeing their retirement savings vanish. These hardships can be reduced by expanding and better communicating existing utility rebate programs to lower the cost of water. We ask that a business-focused utility rebate plan be brought back to the council next month. The Chamber is a willing partner in getting the word out about any and all tools available to our members for them to save money, especially now during such an acute moment of economic uncertainty. Thank you. Have a great meeting.
Thank you, Erica. Any other public comment?
Go ahead.
Anthony? Anybody in the queue?
Thank you. We do not have anybody else in the queue with their hand raised currently, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you for that. With that, I will go ahead and close public comment for the special meeting and move us to the special meeting agenda. Item 1 is an update on the City of Morro Bay's rock solid together financial and economic recovery plan and program. I'll turn it over to our esteemed city manager, Mr. Collins, and finance director, Jennifer Callaway.
Thank you, Mayor, council members, community members. Can you hear me okay, Mayor?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you.
Coming through loud and clear. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen for presentation, which was shared with the public as well as council members. Hopefully you have that. Let's see here. Okay. Can you see my screen okay, Mayor?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you so much. Okay, great. So we are going to give a brief update on the financial situation related to our budget, as well as kind of recap sort of how we got to where we are today. So the city launched the Rock Solid Together plan shortly after COVID-19 hit our community, understanding that there would be significant and severe, potentially long-lasting financial impacts related to the pandemic and all the efforts made to keep our community safe, which led to businesses shuttering or closing for periods of time or completely modifying their operations, and the intended loss of revenue to the city. Ultimately being in this together because we are joined at the hip with our local business community. Their success is ours and vice versa. Prior to COVID-19 hitting, we understood we were also facing some challenges financially after the closure of the power plant combined with the lingering effects of the Great Recession. Had to make a lot of modifications to our operations to continue to tread water, including defunding positions in the city manager's office and public works, reorganizing the utilities division, getting outside funding for positions like the school resource officer at the high school. We engaged in pension reform, a number of ways of doing that, including cost sharing by employees. And we also pursued other financial measures, including cannabis permitting, doing a fee study update, changing our fees, and adopting a fiscal emergency plan, amongst other economic development moves that we've made. Prior to COVID, again, we did provide an update to City Council shortly before the onset of COVID in February of 2020. At that time, we provided an update to the 10-year forecast, which is our tool that we use to really help drive analysis and decision-making surrounding our budget and help prepare for the development of the next year's budget. At that time in February, we projected about a $400,000 deficit going into the next fiscal year. And we saw that deficit growing, if nothing changed, to about 1.4 million.
Excuse me, Mr. Collins, I'm sorry. Kirk, that may be you in the background. We see your picture. You're coming in. Could you mute yourself, sir?
Nope. Yep.
Thank you. Go ahead, Scott. My apologies.
Thank you. No problem. And we saw the deficit growing in our 10-year forecast to 1.4 million by fiscal year 28-29. So certainly something to be concerned about. And we did polling and surveying leading up to that to determine what our community's priorities were. And then next month in March, we declared a local emergency, both a public health and a fiscal emergency related to the pandemic, and activated our short-term fiscal emergency plan that council had adopted in 2018 to help us be prepared for such incidents. So we're clearly in unprecedented times. No need to go into that. We've all been feeling it for a number of months, and are unclear kind of where this is going to go. It's anybody's best guess at this point, but it's something we certainly have lived with and felt deeply since March. We had a special council in April to deliver the Rock Solid Together economic and financial recovery plan. At that time, we were projecting potential revenue impacts of $4 to $5 million, just based upon our economy being primarily driven by tourism, and understanding that folks may not travel and they're being restricted at the state level and the county level. And when we plotted our 10-year forecast after these new projections, we saw that deficit grow to $2.5 million by fiscal year 28-29. So almost a $1.1 million increase after COVID hit compared to previous 10-year forecasts. So unprecedented economic impacts necessitated a revision to the city's primary revenues and an additional update to the 10-year financial forecast, and quick and swift action. I think Jen Calloway is up on this slide.
Yes, thank you, Scott, and good evening, everybody, or good afternoon. I'm going to go through what we are estimating for our year end. I would just note that we are in the process of doing all of our year-end journal entries and preparing for our auditors to come on site mid-October. So these are estimates and could change slightly, but they should not change significantly at this point. So good news, I guess, in some respects, we did not experience revenue losses to the extent that we had estimated in that $2 million range. We're looking at...
Hold a sec, Jesse. Or hold a sec, Zeke. So who is having trouble?
AGP, you're not muted. And we've lost our screen.
Are you able
Hey,
to see
we're leaving your feedback in here. We're going to go off on here for a second.
Pardon me?
Okay.
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay, and can you see the PowerPoint?
We can see you in the PowerPoint now. Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. We are projecting to end the fiscal year at about $1.1 million and less revenues than we had budgeted, and those come from two sources. Our transient occupancy tax came in at about $675,000 less than budgeted. That's about a 20% reduction, which we all expected given how the tourist economy drastically changed in middle of March and April and May. And then in addition, our fees and charges dropped about 18% or $336,000. A lot of that has to do with timing of permits. And so we think we might make some of that up coming into this current fiscal year that we're in. It also has to do with some loss of recreation revenues. Those are all charged under fees and charges. So not totally unexpected. The good news on this slide is that our sales tax and our property tax did hold steady, which we had expected to see decreases in. I still think we'll see decreases in sales tax as we move into this year and our quarterly reports come in, but not perhaps as significantly as we thought. So next slide, please, Scott. So our COVID-19 financial impacts beyond just the general fund, our Measure Q fund had reduced revenues of $110,000. Those again are generated by sales tax, so that aligns a little bit with the overall general fund reductions. We paused our pavement management plan this past fiscal year because we hadn't started work on it and COVID hit. So we wanted to make sure we had enough money to get through the year. Because of that, we saved over $500,000 in expenditures. So we'll be rolling over about $300,000 into our fund balance for Measure Q. And that will likely go towards our pavement management plan for this year, which we will look at starting again in the spring after the winter weather subsides. For our TBID fund, $142,000 in less revenue than we had budgeted. There was about $95,000 in savings in that fund, so we will utilize about $45,000 in reserves to balance that fund out. When COVID first hit and we were looking at impacts, we were thinking we may have to use upwards of $200,000 in reserves, so that's much less than we originally thought. We did experience reduced revenues in our utilities funds. So our water and sewer fund, water was about a loss of $422,000 from what was budgeted, and sewer was about $70,000 from what was budgeted. I would note that I don't believe all of that is due to COVID. We were experiencing some reduced water revenues from budget prior to COVID hitting. That could have been, we just overestimated budget with the rate increases, less water usage going on. I think there's a couple different factors playing into that. And both the water and sewer fund have revenues coming in over expenditures as we're expecting to use cash to help pay for the wharf and setting aside money to fund our capital improvement plan as well as meet our debt service levels. So there isn't actually any utilization of reserves to offset those losses at this point. And then our harbor fund had reduced revenues of $220,000. They did achieve expenditure savings of $110,000. So we'll use about $70,000 of reserves to offset those losses. And we'll be bringing back a full list of budget adjustments at the next council meeting to finalize our closeout of the fiscal year. So this is a little bit of an advanced preview for you on that front. Next slide, please, Scott. And to recap for the current fiscal year that we're in, fiscal year 2020-21, we had run 3 scenarios back in April, early COVID time, estimating a $4 million to $5 million general fund loss. Based on how we ended 1920 and what limited information we have right now with our revenues for fiscal year 2021, those are probably overstated estimates at this point, although I would note that our sales tax revenue is still about 20% less than our transient occupancy tax revenue is still about 20% less than the prior year. So we're still seeing a fairly significant decline in our TOT tax. Next slide, please. Scott, I think you're going to take this over.
I am, thank you. And while we have a pause here, Don, Councilmember Addis, could you do a mic check? The clerk is asking to see if your mic may be working now.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we are inextricably linked to our business community and our broader community for our success and vice versa. And so we came up with Rock Solid Together. It was a recovery for everybody involved. On the business and community side, we deferred transit occupancy tax without penalty or interest for 2 months, and those have been repaid. We waived penalties for late payment for other things like water and sewer and continue to do so. We've discontinued the disconnecting of water service, and that continues to this day through COVID-19. Adopted resolutions supporting what's been done at higher levels of office regarding eviction and price gouging protections. Supported the governor in his sales tax deferral program. Adopted an emergency purchasing program to allow us to change rules in such a way that we can buy locally, which will help our local economy and also expedite purchases of important equipment or other needs related to COVID. We had free transit services for several months. We postponed collection of delinquent garbage accounts. We launched the Morro Bay Cares program, which helps our most vulnerable seniors get access to food and medication. That went on for several months. We expedited permitting for outdoor dining and other business activity, including gyms, and also worked closely with the Coastal Commission staff on an emergency permit to allow for outdoor dining on the waterfront area. In addition, we extended the utility discount program to those who have been laid off affected by COVID-19, deferred a second phase-in for fee increases, modified our chamber contract to assist in outreach to businesses and as well as to the higher levels of government to assist our business community through this tough time, and deferred lease payments for title and trust leases, and several have taken advantage of that program to help them get through this. On the city side, we developed a 4-pillar program to rapidly respond to the crisis. One pillar is employee compensation, the second is operations, the third is emergency reserves, and the fourth is federal, state, and community assistance. On the Rock Solid Together Pillar 1, we had the council and mayor deferral stipends, and most have continued to do that to this point in time. City manager director took up to 8% salary concessions. Our management confidential 5%, police officer association 5%, SEIU 5%, and we're continuing to negotiate with fire association for similar measures. On the operations side, we instituted a hiring freeze. We have 1 vacant police officer position, a planning position, and consolidated maintenance positions. No travel. We laid off a significant number of part-time employees. I mentioned the salary concessions as well as non-salary expense reductions, including our middle marketing contract for tourism, our chamber contract for visitor center. Our city attorney volunteered cost reductions and savings, and we froze virtually all other expenses this time. And then conducted a review and prioritization of services as we understood we would have to do layoffs, and unfortunately had to go beyond the part-time and move into full-time employees. So we've dropped our full-time equivalents from a 99.7 in 2018-19 down to 88.1 for this year. There's been significant reduction in service hours by up to 24,000 hours we're projecting for this fiscal year. That's impacted our recreation department significantly. In many ways, they aren't able to do the programs they typically do, but have been able to support our local economy and our families that have to work by providing childcare service. In addition, it's significantly impacted our tourism operations, where I've laid off the full-time staff member and a part-time staff member. And then in code enforcement, we're down to one code enforcement officer. In planning, as I mentioned, we have a planner position that's been held vacant, which is creating challenges for our staff as there's less staff members around to address the projects coming through the pipeline. And I'll turn it over to Jen to speak briefly about impacts to finance and public works operations, and as well as Jody about the vacant police position. Jen.
Sure. So several of our positions in finance and public works were either defunded or laid off during the COVID crisis. We lost a staff member here in the finance department. Actually resulted in 2 staff members and somebody coming over from another department. So that's created, training, new training, time that we've had to spend with our new person, just reallocation of workload, and less people doing the same amount of work, and in addition to covering for audit and a variety of our year-end processes and reports that we need to complete. So we've been working through that here in finance, and the staff and the ladies here are great, so they're doing a good job, but it's definitely been a big undertaking. And then in our public works department, our public works director position remains unfunded. We have our city engineer on, and then we have an additional associate engineer. We lost another engineering position, so that's causing some delays in processing time and review time. We lost our office assistant position, so finance is trying to help with the AP entry for public works, and we're trying to spread across our contract management next with our public works staff, as well as completing the WIFIA reimbursements for our wharf project, and updating our websites pretty regularly. And then in our consolidated maintenance front, we lost the superintendent as well as one of our consolidated maintenance 3 positions. So that has meant reallocating, getting bids and quotes, coding invoices, processing contracts, getting RFPs out for projects, in addition to just responding to the everyday issues with if there's potholes in streets or trees needing trimming, keeping up with the increased garbage demands, as well as restroom cleaning with all of our tourism. So it's been a pretty big strain on public works. We've worked really hard to not impact service levels despite the loss of staff hours. However, I will say it's not a sustainable model to carry on much longer. So Chief, if you want to talk about police, I can.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Jen. So for the impacts for the police department and having this vacancy, and I'll just start off with adding to the vacancy itself is hiring numerous new officers who have been in the field training process. We've had a couple that have just completed that process, and then one that is currently still in it. And I throw that out first because those officers are not a solo officer that we can use in a solo patrol position. So when we have officers in training, in addition to a vacancy, that compounds some of the problems and the impacts that we're seeing, which is an extra workload that the officers are carrying, the extended shifts and overtime hours because there's not enough personnel to adequately staff 2 officers and a supervisor on all 4 of the patrol shifts. And then when we add the large number of people that are flocking to the coast, that swells our daily population and our transiency population with camping and those kinds of things. So that increases our daily calls for service really on a daily basis. Even though we see much greater impacts over the weekend, we're seeing just day-to-day increases as well, which can also create some officer safety issues as the officers are more frequently responding to calls for service by themselves without available or additional officers to back them up. The increased overtime becomes an issue when the officers need time off, either for their vacation, for training, which is mandatory, both legislatively and statutorily, or if an officer gets sick, having somebody that can backfill those positions. And it also limits our ability to be proactive in the community instead of reactionary by just having officers available to respond to calls for service. I think you see that most in the community engagement details that we were doing a lot of prior to, like our bicycle details, our motorcycle patrol, having designated traffic control enforcement, our neighborhood cop program that we're rolling out. Again, having enough adequate officers assigned to each one of these sections to be able to respond to not only the quality of life issues, but the other calls for service that we're dealing with. The other thing that it does is that it really leaves us susceptible to the officer burnout with the number of hours and overtime that they're working. And again, if an officer gets sick or is unable to respond for his shift, having available cover personnel for that. So currently right now with the vacancy, we're operating at about 1.7 officers per 1,000 residents, which is below the national average of 2.5 for communities of our size. So it's definitely having some impacts to have the vacancy, in addition to having to have new officers that we've had to bring on and train, and then putting them through an extended training program.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you, Jen. In addition to that, the fire department, their administrative assistant position was downgraded from a full-time position to a 3/4 position. So that's impacted their ability to get to do the inspections and things like that are important administrative functions in fire prevention. As you can see in this slide, it's a bit busy, but it, again, shows the total FTE count from 2018-19 to this current year, showing the 11.6% FTE reduction, or 12% of the total FTE count, and the reduced service hours, which the other two explained. We're doing our best to keep up with the demands, and we can do it for a bit longer, but there will be fissures over the long term if nothing changes. In addition, you can see we did do our best to prioritize and maintain the services that our committee told us in the survey last year that are their top priorities, which are public safety, as well as maintaining a clean community. We put a lot more resources into consolidated maintenance than we have in the past. But police and fire, as of now, make up almost 50% of the total general fund budget. Moving on, I think, Jen, this is your slide.
Yes, it is. Thank you. So on to our prioritization of operations, which was Pillar 2. We did achieve about $200,000 in salary and benefit savings, and that flushed out because of vacant positions that we kept vacant, in addition to our salary concessions that were offered by our employee groups. So, without those concessions and sacrifices on a workload level, we would not have achieved that. So that's a significant amount of savings. And then we also achieved well over $400,000 in our operating expenditures, and that comes from contracts. Our city attorney costs are included as contract services. So we had less city attorney costs than we had budgeted, partially due to the rate reduction offered by our city attorney. We stalled all of our contracts that we could when COVID hit. So anything that we could either modify moving forward, like our visitor center contract, or that we hadn't already committed to, we put those on pause with COVID. So our insurance costs were higher than we expected, so that offset some of those. And again, some of these are a little bit of estimates as we continue to close out the year. But in general, I think the takeaway from this is that we did achieve a fairly significant amount of operating savings, over $300,000, to help mitigate that loss in revenue, which for a quarter of the year is a pretty good accomplishment. And I think really is a testament to the city staff trying to frontline service providers get out there and providing the services while still trying to control costs to the extent possible. So we're very grateful for all of our folks out in the field and controlling those costs. Our next slide, please, Scott. Our third pillar, not our last pillar, our third pillar of our Rock Solid Together plan was use of emergency reserves. As I mentioned, we had originally thought we would use about $1 million in reserves. We're going to be using about $900,000 in reserves, and that includes already approved uses of reserves for our CalPERS Tier 2 and 3 payoffs, as well as our lump sum payments to employees that happened very early on in the fiscal year from previously negotiated contracts with the labor groups. So in total, we'll use about $900,000. It's much less than we had anticipated just from COVID. And that leaves us with a projected year-end as of 6/30/2020 fund balance of around $3.2 million, which would be about 26% of our operating expenditures within our general fund emergency reserve policy target zone. Our minimum reserve is 25 and our target is 28. So we're within that buffer period. We do have about $1.3 million in reserves forecasted to be used in fiscal year 2020-21. We don't know what's going to happen in the fall, winter with COVID, if cases will start to spike again, if there'll be another closure, and how long if there's another closure. We also are waiting to see if there'll be a recession that results from this as unemployment benefits start to run out and get reduced. So should we use that $1.3 million in reserves, absent any other new revenues coming into the general fund to offset losses, we would end fiscal year 2021, this current fiscal year, at about $1.9 million in reserve. And that's substantially lower than our general fund emergency reserve targets. It also is a concern to be that low when it could probably only carry you through another fiscal year if there is a recession or some more closures due to the COVID pandemic. So we'll be watching that really closely and remaining very conservative with our expenditures throughout this fiscal year. Next slide, please, Scott. And then the last pillar of our Rock Solid Together plan was state, federal, and community support. We did receive CARES Act funding, about $125,000. That is being issued in 6 equal installments. We've received 2 this year, this current fiscal year so far. So we received about $40,000. You have to report out on that quarterly. We've completed 1 reporting of those funds. And in that first reporting, we did expend all of the $125,000 that we received. But we will have to continue to report on additional expenditures. And the state is really trying to capture a whole story of our California communities and the expenses that we've incurred to try to work at the national level to get some additional support coming forward. So we'll continue on with that reporting for the next five quarters. We've also submitted our Fema reimbursement requests for the first few months of COVID. That process is a little bit more cumbersome to get through. They've sent back several rounds of questions related to our expenditures. So we're working to continue to respond to those questions and give them the information they need so they can hopefully approve those reimbursements in the very near future. Scott, I think you're on to the next slide, please.
Thank you. And I failed to mention also, I know we're focused primarily on the general fund here, but the Harbor Department, they are down in admin position and certainly trying to do their best to ramp up things like their RV camping program and dealing with all the needs of our lessees and subtenants on the waterfront leases. But it's definitely feeling an impact and the remaining folks trying to keep up with the workload. So just want to make sure that was noted. As we move forward, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are inextricably tied to our community success and our business community success, and we're really trying to find the right balance to support all of ourselves, through this tough time, and finding that right balance is critical so that we can continue to thrive moving forward. With that in mind, the city staff did talk with council earlier on the onset of COVID-19 spring about a potential grant program, as well as deferral of lease payments for Title and Trust master lease and subtenant leaseholders, and we have extended that program for several months now. But we did at the time, we didn't really know kind of where this was going with COVID, and so I think the grant loan program was sort of put on the side. Didn't have a lot of support at the time from the business community. I think everybody was trying to get their head wrapped around the federal programs and potential state programs coming down the pipe. But now that we've been in this for quite some time, and while the county seems to be moving in a good direction, we know that with flu season upon us and what's happening in Europe and what happened in the southern hemisphere during their winter, we can probably expect a resurgence, and we need to be able to assist our businesses. They've made a lot of modifications to their business. They've added new protocols to keep their clients and customers safe and the general community safe, and that they've onboarded a lot of extra costs to do that. And a lot of other communities talked about and have implemented micro loan or grant programs. And so we felt it was imperative to bring this back as a potential discussion or future discussion for council if you're interested in doing that. We know that we have our leases on the waterfront, which is a different subgroup of our overall business community. We've extended the deferral of rents to the city, and some have taken advantage of that. And there's a lot of our lessees down there are sort of wondering if there will be permanent relief for some of that, and a lot of discussions with staff. And so one opportunity could be to create a grant program specific to our lessees. We have the Economic Development Fund, which is funded by Senate Bill 1090 money related to the closure of Diablo. So it's not general fund money. It's meant specifically for economic development opportunities, and potentially what better thought than to assist our businesses through this very unprecedented time. In addition to that, there could be a similar program for businesses outside of the Title and Trust area. Again, loans or grants. We'd love to hear from council if there's interest in doing that. We have lots of examples within the county with Grover Beach, Paso Robles, and City of SLO all rolling out grant programs recently, and again, could use the Economic Development Fund, not the general fund, for something like that. So in closing, prior to COVID, we anticipated some long-term financial challenges, and COVID-19 has certainly exacerbated that for us and created even more difficult challenge. The city and the community responded swiftly and thoroughly, but we still face significant challenges. We had to cut in most departments, as we showed in our slides, and attempted to preserve as best we can the core public safety and cleanliness services that our community told us are their top priorities in the survey done last year. Despite these efforts, we project our emergency reserves could run out by the beginning of fiscal year 22-23, unless other action is taken. The balance sheet includes both expenditures and revenues or income. So we do have opportunities for new revenue, which council has discussed. We have economic development opportunities with opportunity sites in marketing ourselves and looking at new developments, hotel developments, and those things which can provide ongoing sources of revenue to the city. We are having a contract let to assess city property to see if we have a potential to sell or lease some of the city property, which could typically provide one-time funding, but if it's under a lease, could be ongoing funding. We just recently rolled out the RV camping program, which will primarily benefit our harbor fund, but could also help our general fund. And that program launched earlier this month, and we're going to run it for a trial basis and then report back to council and ultimately the Coastal Commission if we want to extend that program. We have a adult use cannabis shop opening either this month or next month, which will provide ongoing source of revenue, and of course the Measure E, which is on the ballot, which will provide ongoing source of revenues. These revenues options combined could help preserve core services, those that again were identified as key priorities for our community, and also create an opportunity to invest in projects that contribute to our quality of life. That's roads, parks, restrooms, waterfront, sidewalk, as well as infrastructure that supports city services like our IT systems, our vehicles, and other critical equipment that we haven't been able to invest in recent years. So with that, we conclude our presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that council may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Jennifer, for the comprehensive overview of our current financial situation. Can you hear me okay? AGP?
Yes, we can hear you, Mayor.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, we can hear you.
I don't see a visual on there. But again, thank you for the comprehensive overview of our not only year-ending financial status, but revised projections for next year. I'll go ahead and open it up for council questions, and maybe I could start. Jen, could you explain to me the rather significant insurance variance for 1920 of $234,000 for the fiscal year 1920? What specifically occurred that variance was that high?
So we don't typically get our insurance estimate costs until after our budget is developed. So sometimes, we go off of previous years. If insurance goes up, we might not have a good understanding of that until we've developed our budget. And we also capture our workers' comp through our payroll, and then we pay it through insurance. So that's part of our year-end closing process that we're still working on. And I'm not sure that entire amount is going to be allocated to the general fund, because it'll be spread through our utilities funds as well, whatever portion they pay. So that was my rough estimate at this time. It may end up being a little bit less when we come back in 2 weeks with our budget adjustments.
Okay. And the contract service savings that we had for fiscal year 1920, budget versus actuals, totaling about $303,000. And I think you said there were mainly two components. Was that mental marketing and also the city attorney's office?
So mental marketing would have come out of our key bid, not our general fund, and that was our general fund's savings. Our city attorney's office, we saved about, looking it up right now, I would say about $75,000 roughly. Some of that is just less services than maybe we had budgeted for, and then a portion of that is also the rate reduction that was offered up by the city attorney's office. And then we have a bunch of smaller categories of contractual services, such as street repairs, tree trimming, all those kind of little things that added up to a fairly significant amount, in totality.
And the savings projections for next year, does the city attorney reduction continue into this fiscal year that we're currently in?
I'll let Chris speak to that. It's still ongoing at the moment. I don't know if he wants
that
to.
Was my question, if it was still ongoing. That's
yes.
fine. Okay, good.
Mr. Mayor,
Appreciate that.
City Attorney's Office
Yes.
is going to maintain its reductions in fees as long as the directors and staff are maintaining theirs. And my understanding is they're continuing theirs through the calendar year. So I'll make sure my office does so as well.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Jen, with regard to cannabis revenues with the potential of one shop opening up, do we have any estimates for this fiscal year of for the remainder of the year what revenues may well be, just out of curiosity?
It's definitely a rough estimate. We know how successful Grover Beach was in obtaining additional revenues, about $750,000, I believe, but they also have more shops and a broader range of services being provided. With one shop opening, and if they open next month, you'll get about 3/4 of a year. I would estimate maybe 200,000-ish, but again, that's a pretty rough estimate.
Okay, good. Just wanted to try to understand the magnitude of that. And then for the benefit maybe of our public and maybe even for the remainder of council, could you explain what FEMA reimburses for and differentiate that from the operational shortfalls that we have in terms of assuming that FEMA might cover that?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that neither FEMA nor the CARES Act will reimburse for lost revenue. So we don't get to submit $600,000 for lost TOT and have it cover that. FEMA, our first round of reimbursements that we submitted for the first few months, we focused on our signage around town. Those were the electronic signs that we rented early on in COVID, the signage that we've put up for the face masks, the social distance, all of our PPE expenses that we incurred for face coverings, our sanitation supplies, gloves. We went through a significant amount of that, particularly in our public safety field, as they made contact with people every day. They were constantly having to change out PPE, as well as in our consolidated maintenance and utilities fields. And then we submitted as well for the addition of our porta potties, our portable restrooms down on the Embarcadero, our hand washing stations, anything that was above and beyond what we normally would do, we've submitted for requests. FEMA has struggled a bit that this is not, typically a FEMA disaster. You typically would think of a hurricane. So their protocols didn't really fit well with a pandemic. And so I think that's part of the going back and forth with a lot of questions, and a lot of very detailed questions. So they want, exact GIS spots for where we place signage, for where we had the portables, how that was connected to COVID. So that's what we're working through with them at this point. I also note that the CARES Act had a much broader coverage. You were able to submit for a much broader base. We submitted for the reimbursement for our public safety staff during COVID. They qualified public safety response as substantially related to COVID during that time period. So that was the simplest thing for us to reimburse for. We also noted all of the other costs that we were incurring, again, to help with that California story of what cities were doing. But we did not, and I will repeat this, we did not submit for reimbursement for CARES anything that we've submitted for FEMA, because we wouldn't want to duplicate those efforts.
So I guess what I'm hearing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, the bottom line is the city, or any city in California, maybe even across the country, should not expect that we're going to be bailed out by the federal government with regard to either the CARES Act or FEMA reimbursement, which FEMA is a special category, I know, but we shouldn't look to, at least from what I've seen, and I'm just looking for your view of this, that we're going to have bailout money available for the general fund losses that we're going to incur over the next 2 or 3 years based on COVID-19.
I think that, I see Scott's going to weigh in on that too. I think that's a completely accurate statement. that we will not recoup the full costs that we incurred due to COVID. And the city manager might want to add on to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. The Congress was in somewhat of a negotiating stance regarding another CARES Act, but there was wide discrepancy between what the House and Senate were talking about. The Senate didn't want any inclusion for state or local government assistance, where the House was very adamant that there be support even up to the level of $500 billion. So it's anybody's guess how this election is going to go and what the fallout may be for next year. But at this point, there appears to be absolutely no effort being made for another CARES Act, one that would include local government assistance.
Great, thank you both for that. And then Jen, with regard to our capital budget, I assume historically, I'll just make the remark that we have not been able to significantly fund capital improvement funds or put aside capital funds for capital improvements significantly in the city due to just in general operational shortfalls, except for the One Water program, which continues to be funded through the water and sewer basic fees. But is there any are there any capital funds being set aside now significantly that will help us to plan for long-term breakdown of equipment expenditures, et cetera?
There is not. Per the council's adopted revenue policy, new revenues such as cannabis would be dedicated to one-time projects for 2 years per the policy. So that would be a potential source to set aside for equipment replacement, infrastructure needs. For example, our pavement management plan is not enough expenditure to even maintain the current road conditions. So the roads are going to continue to deteriorate. I believe it's upwards of $2 million to even just maintain them. And we are not setting aside nor have that kind of money to allocate to roads alone. So any of the additional new revenues that are really new, meaning cannabis, would be a funding source to help with those costs. Cannabis isn't going to cover the full cost of that. That's a little bit different than our sales tax, because that's more of, we know that's going to be a reliable, sustainable revenue source. So those wouldn't have to be allocated to one-time costs. But no, we do not have an active capital program going on outside of our utilities program.
So with the decline in our general fund emergency reserves being expected to decrease at the end of the fiscal year 6/30/2021 to 1.894, about $1.9 million, is there any way from an operational standpoint that there would be the opportunity to further reduce costs of operations, both on the labor side and or the expense side, other expense side, to be able to make up for that kind of significant general fund depletion?
No, there is not. Not in my opinion.
So suffice it to say, a large injection of new revenues is paramount to the future success of the city, such as the 1 cent sales tax increase. Is that a fair statement?
I would say that's a fair statement, and I would say that I'd just like to point out that we don't know yet what implications will happen with PERS as a result of the market losses that were incurred. They recouped some, but PERS is going to remain to be a question mark for a couple of years, and something that the city, we already know we have increased costs coming, but likely we'll have even more increases from that. So I think your statement is accurate, and I would say maybe, even add on to that there's still quite a few unknowns with some other costs.
And my last question, and perhaps the chief can chime in. I was a bit taken back by our ratio of officers per thousand at 1.7 currently versus 2.5 being, I think was quoted the national average. Chief, have we ever been at 2.5, and what are the consequences of not being able to fund the police department adequately to maintain that average of 2.5? And I think you touched on some of those, but I just want to reiterate and hear it again from you.
Yes, Mayor. Back in, I believe it was about 05, 06, we had, it was either 22 or 23 officers at that time. So the reduction that we've had over the years, we've never recovered from that reduction. We were at 18 sworn, and then as budget constraints came in, as you know, we lost a position in the SRO. And it took me about a year to renegotiate with the school district and the school district's agreement to then fully fund that position, which brought us back to the 18 total. And then, of course, through the COVID issue, we've again had the vacancy that we have now taking us down to 17. And that's how we got to 1.7. So, yeah, we've had higher numbers that would put us at about what the national average is. And again, the significance, like I talked about, is our ability to respond to in-progress crimes and having an adequate number of officers. We would like to have 2 officers and a supervisor on every shift. As you know, when we make arrests here in the city, that often requires that the officers transport that person either to be medically cleared or to the county jail, which are both outside of the city limits. So that at times could leave one officer in the city handling calls for service for extended hours at a time, which creates some officer safety and community safety issues without having that adequate personnel on board. And again, that then requires us to backfill some of those positions with overtime. So each week, and just roughly as the officers work 12-hour shifts, one of those shifts on one day should be an 8-hour shift, but due to the staffing levels, they're usually required to work that extra 4-hour period on overtime because of the staffing levels. And again, when we have any other type of significant event, and with the sheer numbers of people that we've had over the last several months, trying to maintain adequate staffing for the city levels has again increased our overtime hours, and again with training, not only our new officers, the field training program that requires the officer be teamed up with a training officer until they pass a 16-week training program, which allows them to operate as a solo officer. But backfilling those positions has cost us significantly in overtime costs.
And I imagine productivity is always a concern, or burnout, when your officers are having to work significant amounts of overtime.
It is. I try to encourage them to take off the time that they can. Again, it becomes difficult to give them extended time off. Again, with mandates for training and things that we have to get accomplished. Sometimes even in the middle of their days off, I'm requiring them to come in to complete some type of training. And again, then you have court that the officers are required to attend, which often falls on their days off. So yeah, it does lead to considerable burnout, just with the sheer amount of time that they're having to spend here. And again, with COVID, we've been very, very fortunate as a city, and especially as city employees, that none of our staff have been out with extended illness or been personally impacted by COVID. So we've been very fortunate there, but it definitely takes its toll on the officers' physical and mental well-being.
Great. Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that information. With that concludes my questions, and I'll turn it over now to Councilmember McPherson. Any questions?
I do have some, and thank you. And thank you for this comprehensive and very impressive update. My first question really concerns, since we've just touched on the police officers, tell me about all of the other employees and what the impact has been on them, and how is their morale, since they're having to do more with less. How is the rest of the staff handling it?
Oh, great question, Councilman McPherson. We did an employee survey and just kind of assess kind of how things are going and see what trends are going on here at the city. And by and large, I think employees understand that this is a unprecedented time, and so The expectations obviously have to change with that, but as this drags on, they are definitely feeling it or wearing out a bit, especially in those departments where we've seen reductions in staffing, either through layoffs or vacancies or both in some cases. And definitely with the pay cuts ongoing, they're feeling that too. But I would still say that they are working valiantly to hold their missions and achieve the city goals, show up every day. As the chief mentioned, we're very fortunate. We haven't had any illnesses related to COVID on the city staff side. So we've been blessed in that regard. But, as this wears on, it's definitely wearing on staff, just like it is our community members and our folks in the business community too.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question for Jen. I was looking at the expenditures, and I know you presented the table, and it's also in the staff report. And in the expenditures for this fiscal year, this previous fiscal year, there's another category, and it's fairly significant. There was, it's over budget. So I'm just curious to know what kinds of things are included in the other category, and if you can explain the overage of.
Sure. So the other category is actually some of the standby pays or some of the acting pays, include some of our fire reimbursements. So I didn't include that with salary and benefits because they're a little bit of anomalies. And I didn't think we really reflected the salary and benefits savings that were achieved because of the concessions and the layoffs. They are kind of those especially anomaly pays that we had, again, like when the fire goes out on their calls, and if somebody's in an acting status, for example.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And would you explain, and this is for the benefit of anybody watching, the purpose of an emergency reserve fund and what kinds of emergencies should it be used for?
Sure. So our emergency reserve policy that was adopted by council really outlines the purpose and what emergency reserves are for. It lists a number of things, such as maintaining short-term and long-term financial health of the city, stabilizing user rates for customers, if that's something we're trying to do, fund unanticipated expenditure contingencies, including emergencies, infrastructure improvements, significant, it helps with a positive credit bond rating if we need that. So all of that's outlined in the policy that was approved by council. Typically, we think of emergency reserves to offset losses if there's a recession or a downturn in the economy that we need to react to. You can fill a gap with some reserves until there's a longer term plan put in place. You could utilize emergency reserves if there was a natural disaster, such as a tsunami or an earthquake or a fire. Oftentimes, a lot of those expenses are reimbursed, but you need to front the costs for those. Emergency reserves are available to do that as well.
So, yeah, so basically it's for unforeseen events that you couldn't have planned for. So I assume that COVID-19 obviously qualifies as the type of an emergency that you would want to use emergency fund reserves for. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Something that is unanticipated, that you can't plan for. It's really that savings account to help you weather through those times.
And you have indicated that it's best practice for a city to maintain a reserve fund that is 25% at least of its annual budget, which would mean that you could keep going for about 3 months. You could continue operating the city for 3 months on that amount. Is there a minimum recommended amount as well?
I believe GFOA says the absolute minimum is maybe 16%, 17%. It's, I think, 2 months of operating expenditures. They do qualify that by saying that it really depends on the entity's revenue sources and what are your primary revenue sources. 25% is typically thought of as the best practice. We adopted our policy here to be a minimum of 25% and a target of 28%. And we did that understanding that we are so heavily reliant on tourism, with 25% of our revenues being TOT and a significant portion of our sales tax being driven by TOT. We wanted to be able to cover a little bit longer of a period with reserves should there be a major impact to our tourist economy, which is what we experienced with COVID.
Okay. And I know that we did not talk about the water and sewer funds, but isn't it also the case that Carollo Engineers took a reduction in rates? And so that's also a savings?
Carollo did offer up rate concessions as well. I think Scott could provide more information on how much that really resulted in or what their rate reductions were, but they did offer that up, and that is part of the savings for the overall wharf project, which is a capital project and not included in the water or sewer funds from an operating perspective.
And I think you indicated earlier that the fact that revenues are down also in those funds will not impact our ability to continue working on the wharf. We will have cash on hand to keep the program going. Is that correct?
That's correct. So our original intention was to utilize cash on hand to fund the wharf project rather than drawing on our financing. But with the WIFIA financing being 0.83%, up until fairly recently, we were earning more money and interest on our cash that we had in our LEAF accounts and our other investments. So it made sense to utilize our WIFIA financing. I still would suggest that in the long term, we'll eventually achieve better interest rates than the 0.83%. So it makes sense to use that financing up front, hang on to our cash on hand, and once all of the final components of the project are realized, we can make some decisions as to or provide council with some options to either advance some capital projects with some of the savings received from the low interest rates or a few other options. So there should be no impact to rates because of the lost revenues, at least for this 1 year. We wouldn't have any stall on the project. It'll continue to move forward.
Okay, thank you. And my last set of questions actually has to do with this possibility of loans or grants for businesses. And I'm just curious to know, do we currently have a plan for rent payback for the Embarcadero lease sites? Or are they still working on that?
Good question. I think that's an opportune time to bring that up. We've had a couple discussions and we haven't gotten very far in terms of different opportunities, but there have been lease sites that did really well this summer, that because we had an influx of tourists we weren't expecting and a lot of the dining out options, a lot of day trippers who maybe not staying in a vacation rental or a hotel, but they're down on the waterfront and buying food. Some of our folks down there did quite well, where others had struggles. And so doing a one-size-fit-all type of program may not make sense, which is sort of being discussed at this time, whereas a grant program may be more apropos for their situation. And those who, even if they're doing well, may have spent a lot of additional money to be able to provide the service they've been providing this summer. So it may fit better if we do a grant program for them. But as far as the lease payments being continued, deferral that is being taken advantage of by several of them, and we think that's probably a good idea, especially as we head into what could be a tumultuous period with the winter. So more to come on that, but I think the grant program could address some of those issues.
And do we actually know how many of them are basically closed and not operating, and how many intend to come back? Have we done any kind of a survey of the leaseholders on the Embarcadero? And I might add, to all of our businesses.
Yeah, Erica Crawford, the chamber might have a better idea generally as far as all businesses are concerned. Eric Indersby's on the line. I don't know if he's done a specific audit yet or not, but he might have a general idea of kind of where things are at on the waterfront.
Yeah, we haven't. Good evening. Mayor and Council. We haven't done any formal polling, and like the city manager said, maybe Erica has a better idea. She keeps her finger closer on that pulse. Most folks, I don't think there's any lease sites that don't have some kind of operation going on. Even Rose's Landing that has that major construction upstairs, although they're largely shut down because of the construction. Everybody, I think, has got some level of activity going, but obviously not all with the restaurants and everything else. But most retail is open, and most restaurants are operating on a limited basis.
And so have they paid back any of the ones who took the deferral of rent? Have any of them paid back the rent?
Yeah, I think there were 9 initially that deferred rent starting back in like April, May. A good number have been paying back over time, and including some of their percent gross rent, which became due on July 1st once they added up last fiscal year's numbers. We're down to, oh boy, I don't have the exact number. I want to say we had about 120,000, 130 in deferred rent initially back in the spring, early summer, and I think we're down into 5 digits, maybe 75, 80,000 still outstanding. So some have paid off, but some are still carrying it on the books.
And I understand that there is a group that's working on trying to come up with some recommendations to council. Is that right?
Yes. Years ago, there used to be a C3, nonprofit leaseholder group that formed to address issues on the waterfront with the waterfront leaseholders in the city. And it kind of dissolved, I want to say 15 years ago now, maybe 20, and never was really active. And that group, mainly because of this issue, is reformed. I think they're not doing a nonprofit, they're doing an actual corporation or an LLC, but they've reformed. I think they've got their organization officially up and legally running. And we, finance director and myself and Lori Stilts have been meeting with a subgroup of that organization and working back and forth and trying to negotiate some potential scenarios on how we deal with the deferred rent and rent moving forward as well, assuming COVID continues to be an economic impact, which looks like it is going to be.
Okay. Well, thank you. Those are my questions. I appreciate the opportunity to ask them.
Thank you. Councilmember Heller, sir, questions?
Yeah, here, let me start my video. There's Washington crossing to Delaware, unless, of course, that's fake news and it never really happened, which I can't comment on. Okay, so the parking plan, I know, Scott Collins, that we've hired a consultant to put together a parking plan. Can you give me a brief timeline on when that would be completed? Is there a chance that the Coastal Commission might help us with a pilot program and get that up and running so we could generate some revenue in that way?
Great question, Councilmember Heller. We did attempt to do a pilot program through the emergency permit, and we were denied by the Coastal Commission. They sent back a letter explaining why, because we were sort of perplexed, and they explained, well, you're in COVID, you probably shouldn't be harming people who are already struggling by making them pay to park in Morro Bay. So that was sort of their initial take, and they said, no, by the way, if you want to do something more permanent, here are the questions you got to answer. So we've definitely clued into that, those questions that they're seeking answers to in our work being done by our consultants. The consultant did an initial run of a survey back in August, I want to say mid-August, and during kind of peak season, which was great to sort of capture peak season, both during the week and the weekend. They looked at downtown, waterfront, and the Rock parking lot. They're going to send back results of that to me shortly, and then they're going to come back in late fall, most likely November, seemingly. We would expect things to slow down by then and get a read on what the off season for parking will look like, especially if you're going to move into a paid parking situation. Morro Bay, we have an on-off switch, it seems like. And so if we do go into paid parking, you need to understand what those impacts may be on the off season, because that could have a negative impact on your economic vitality if your only options are paid parking, but there's a lot of spaces that are open. So a little early to say where the analysis is going to go, but we would hope to have everything wrapped up from the study probably by the end of the calendar year or into early next year, and then bring back discussions to PWAB and the City Council. Hopefully get to Coastal Commission before the summer of next year. That would be ambitious, but I think we can make that so long as they're party to having that discussion. And we will reach out to them. We have been talking to them offline about it, so they're not caught off guard when we come forward.
Okay, thank you for that. Cannabis. So the one store on Quintana looks like it's getting ready to open. What's happening with the store on Morro Bay Boulevard?
My understanding with Natural Healing Center, which is what on Morro Bay Boulevard, is that they are opening other stores in other communities, and I think they're a bit spread thin. I think Scott Graham talked to them recently, might have a better update on that, but I know they want and are eager to get going here. I think they've taken on a lot at one time. I think they're also opening up a store in San Luis Obispo. So I don't have a timetable on that, but I do expect Perfect Union on Quintana will be open within the next several weeks. Scott, are you able to expand on NHC?
Scott.
Sorry, buddy, you're muted. Might be the Zoom. Well,
sign language.
It's going to be a problem for later tonight. Vacation.
Okay, we'll get back to you.
Sorry, Mr. Heller, I can't answer.
No worries.
I think it's pretty much in line with what I said. I hope.
Okay. In talking about fees in general, I know we've postponed implementation of our fee increases until the end of the fiscal year, I believe, but should we maybe consider increasing some of the fees that visitors pay sooner? You know, I think of the boat launch ramp, which seems really undervalued for what we charge for it. Maybe the mooring fees. What else? It's not a huge amount of money, but I think we're really undervaluing ourselves, and we have an inferiority complex here in Morro Bay. And I just think we should charge a lot more for what people get who come here. So I'd like to see us look at that. As far as capital needs, I'm concerned about that. I know this is not going to be popular with people, but I really believe that there's money to be saved on the management fees that we're paying on the wharf. And to respond to Erica Crawford's concerns about a discount program for water and sewer costs for businesses, I think that's an important thing to look at. And I think we could fund that if we sat down and negotiated with Carollo and got something, a much better rate across the board. I understand their lead person has taken a cut or not increased his rate, but I guarantee you there's a lot of money sitting on the table that we need, frankly, to help our businesses. Is this time for another Blue Ribbon Committee to come to the rescue here and come up with some great ideas that we haven't thought of? I don't know. Maybe so. The question I really wanted to ask that I've been thinking about, I think the state of California, and I know the mayor of Los Angeles have declared fiscal emergencies. I don't know what that all means. Mayor Heading, do you know about that? Can you explain to me what that means, what that would entail, whether that's a good or a bad thing for us?
We have declared that here, and it does if potentially there are any funds available from the state and or the feds that must be declared in order to be eligible for certain grant and or funding streams that may come down. So it's more of a ceremonial act to put one into position to receive funds should they come from the federal and state level. Although our Congressman Carbajal has been very actively advocating through the caucus for the CARES Act to help fund cities like Morro Bay and communities that are hurting greatly due to COVID-19. The outlook is pretty much my term dismal in terms of the availability of a significant funding coming either from the state, which is facing about a $50 billion shortfall, and or the federal government.
Okay, so the emergency we declared a few months ago is pretty much the same thing. Nothing special about it.
Right.
Okay, so what is the path forward if we deplete our emergency reserve funds? What do we do then?
Well,
Well, you make if you don't make it up on the revenue side, you make further cuts. As I think I showed the slide, half of our budget is public safety. So the next round of cuts would include public safety because we've pretty much worn all the other departments down as thin as we can to continue to provide any services. So that's the next round of cuts would be police and fire.
Okay.
Council Member Heller, can I just add onto that part of this whole process is really thinking about the future and when we get to that kind of dangerously low level of reserves. A lot of cities will declare a fiscal emergency, not a lot. Oftentimes when cities declare a fiscal emergency outside of a pandemic situation or other natural disasters, it's because they want to add some kind of tax measure onto a non-general election ballot, and you have to declare an emergency to do that. That's not the case here, but I just wanted to clarify that. Part of this is really forecasting that out, looking at our reserves, being very conservative, and coming up with some options for the council to consider in terms of expenditure reductions and revenue additions before we run out of reserves. And at one point we shared a slide, I think during the budget session, on our cash balances and what we have in cash. There's some ability that we could borrow cash from different funds if we needed to, if we did run out of reserves. We don't want to do that. It's not a great plan. But if we got to fiscal year 22, 23, and we were out of reserves, and we were spending more than we were taking in, that is a short-term solution. You would be able to borrow some cash from some of the other funds. So I just wanted to add that on there, that from a cash position, we're doing okay as a whole city. But we need to be cognizant of what is general fund and what's in our reserves, because that won't be the situation forever.
Okay, I appreciate that explanation. I guess maybe the other thing we could do is some kind of a property tax assessment, a special election or something. I mean, is that an option as well over the next year and a half?
Absolutely, Mr. Hall. You could do some kind of parcel tax or assessment. The caveat there is that they, I think, require 2/3 vote of the public. When you do property tax, it's usually a specific tax for a specific purpose. So you do have to meet that threshold to get approval.
Okay. What else? Let's see here. Any chance we can operate the city with 50% volunteers? Probably not. I know you laugh, but I do want to acknowledge that we do have quite a number of volunteers, maybe not directly with the city, but do a lot on behalf of the city. The beautification groups, of course, and folks who help with our low-income or homeless population who serve in a volunteer capacity, and those who assist our police department and through Neighborhood Watch. I mean, we have a very active, we're very fortunate that way, very active and generous community in that regard. But to sort of shift the model all to more of a volunteer base would certainly be a complete shift. And I'm curious if there are cities out there who have gone that direction. Curious what other cities are doing as well. I'm sure you're talking to them. Yeah. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Councilmember Heller. Councilmember Davis, sir, questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Jen, there was on one of your slides the summary of preliminary year-end revenue figures as compared to budget, and there was the sales tax line item that showed that we did not take a hit in sales tax, and yet the governor has a program of deferring sales tax payments. Are we being affected by that deferral?
Yeah, I was surprised by that as well when I pulled the sales tax numbers. Again, as part of that year-end closing process, we'll be going through all the detail in that to make sure there's nothing misallocated into that account. I don't believe there is at this point. That tells me that businesses really didn't take advantage, or businesses that we deal with take advantage of the 90-day deferral. There is that option of a 12-month deferral for the larger businesses. Also, there's a little bit of a different reporting periods for sales tax. So there's our HDL estimate. That's our consultant is estimating about a 10% reduction for next year. So we may see that lag a little bit as we go into the next fiscal year. And it's too early at this point. We don't have a lot of sales tax in for this current fiscal year to really tell if we're going to see that or not.
Okay. And then the CARES funding that we are receiving, I didn't quite understand how that was timed. We will receive a total of $125,000 in 6 payments. We've already received 2 payments, but I think Scott said something about we reported the full amount in the first quarter. I didn't quite get that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right with everything you said. So it's $125,000. It's $126,000 and some odd dollars, but basically $125,000. They do it in equal installments, 6 equal installments. So ours are about $20,000 each, a little over $20,000. We have to report. The first quarterly report was due in September. And we submitted that, and under the way the format for the reporting is set up, you reported out how much you expensed in whatever categories you're claiming, and they ask you, what percentage expensed are you? Have you fully expensed your $125,000? Have you only, expensed 50% of that? And because we used our public safety personnel costs, we, well exceeded the $125,000 that will be allocated. So we included that full amount on there to support our reimbursements. And then in a separate reporting column, we added everything else we've spent, again, to help with that overall story of what communities are doing with COVID and how much their expenses are how much they're incurring in expenses. We'll continue to report out every quarter on what our expenses are. But the important piece to note is we've exceeded our $125,000 in reimbursements and expenditures, and we'll continue to do that as we accrue expenses related to COVID.
Okay, so we are in effect telling them what we actually spend regardless of what they're reimbursing us for. Okay.
Correct.
I want to ask some questions about the possibility of business grants. Scott mentioned that the source of funds would be our economic development funding. How many grants would we consider, and how much money would be involved, and how do you select who receives the grants?
Yeah, you as council can set, kind of the thresholds on all that, either sort of get general direction tonight or have this come back as a separate item in the next meeting or special meeting. Some cities I've researched, they offer grants that are on a first come, first served basis, and others have, as long as certain criteria are met, and some require, formal applications and a review of all those that come in after a deadline, and use, typically it's a chamber representative and city manager, maybe a council member, or some variation of that review the applications and then issue awards. So it can kind of run the gamut. Typically, most cities, it's for small businesses only, which most, I would assume all businesses in Morro Bay would qualify. Obviously, you have some kind of impact related to COVID, whether it was a closure, modification of business operations, and the like. Grants ran anywhere from $2,500. It was a typical number. 5,000 was a typical number, and I saw as high as 10 or 20,000, depending on how much money was on the table. Places like Bakersfield got millions of dollars in CARES Act grant funding, whereas we got 100,000. So we, just to give kind of the scale, and they're using their CARES Act for that programming. In our community, or in our county, Paso and SLO and Grover Beach are all running programs, and some are using Senate Bill 1090 money, and the others are using CARES grant. So in the county, they're all using a sort of a grading process with a review, not a first come, first serve. So if we were to do, $150,000, we could probably issue on a $2,500 to a $5,000 grant level, and 40 to 50 or 60 businesses could receive an award, just as an example.
Okay, and in order for you to pursue that, you would need for a majority of council tonight to ask you to do that?
I'll leave it up to the attorney to figure out best to do that. I think in our agenda report, we said, in other direction is appropriate. I think probably giving some general parameters, if we can get there tonight, to bring it back for final review next council meeting would be appropriate, as opposed to trying to get it all locked in now. But I'll leave it up to the attorney, because I know businesses are feeling the pain now, and sooner it could be better for a lot of them.
I believe direction given to staff to follow through on what it means to have a rock solid together financial and economic recovery plan, which is the subject of this report. And it says recommendation is provide direction as deemed appropriate, means that council certainly can provide direction to staff in terms of financial recovery, helping businesses, et cetera. That's inclusive for tonight's agenda item.
Okay, thank you. And I have one last question. I want to delve a little bit into our fire department staffing. Chief Cox gave us an excellent overview of what's going on with the police department. But I would like to get some information about how we are staffing 3 shifts. And my first question is, do we have 12 full-time equivalent paid firefighter positions to staff those 3 shifts?
Thank you, Council and Councilman Davis. No. One of the reasons why the fire department wasn't really touched during this recent budget cuts, we've been minimal staffing for 20 plus years, and we've just been making it work. Basically, we have 12 slots, and we have 11 full-time personnel. We covered a 12 spot with a part-timer and also with overtime. But we also have a lot of time that people are off shift for training, vacation, sick. For example, right now I have a person out on industrial leave on an injury, and I have to cover that person with an overtime or, if I can, part-time employees. We're basically are on the organizational design of 1950, which is that we heavily rely on our reserve component and also our full-timers coming back from home on their day off to respond to calls. And today's society is not supporting that very much. It's not the same. And one of the reasons why is the increase of training that Cal OSHA has put onto the fire service in the last 20 years, that the typical firefighter is mandated 464 hours a year of annual training just to maintain equivalency for their job. And that's not even accounting for EMT or paramedic continuing education on top of that. So the training requirements has really pushed away the volunteerism portion of the fire service in California. And we basically are covering it with part-timers and overtime and just making it work. So, for example, if any future cuts in the fire department would mean that we were not going to be able to respond to about 20% of our calls, and we would have to rely on folks coming from home to come in, which is getting less and less reliable, or depending on our mutual aid, which mutual aid wasn't really meant for. So I really hope I answered your question on that.
Okay, so you're not really able to take any personnel cut without reducing service.
Yeah, any type of additional cuts to the fire department would mean that we would not be able to cover 2 calls at once, which is about 21% of our calls. So You're right. If any future cuts in the fire department will mean that we will not be able to respond code 3 under response time on 20% of our calls, we would have to wait until the first call was finished, and then we can respond to it.
Okay. Thank you. And Jennifer and Scott, thank you very much for the presentation, and that's all my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. Councilmember Addis, questions, please.
Goodness, I think everybody else asked most of my questions. The biggest for me was around support for small businesses and the desire to get something going on those and how quickly we might be able to do that. I know you, but I think you just said you could bring something back maybe at the next meeting.
Yes, the next meeting or a special meeting, if we can arrange all of your business, of course. So yeah, if we had even a sprinkling or inkling of, the general direction on this would make it easier for us to develop something pretty quickly. Because we know, and talking with the chamber and other business folks, they're hurting out there.
And has, I know I heard Erica speak earlier in the meeting, or Ms. Crawford speak earlier in the meeting about the need to do something, but have we had very much explicit input or any kind of feedback on I guess I'm looking for guidance on what's being asked for in terms of help? Is it just a straight, I think before we proposed like a $5,000 grant program or something, and that wasn't, it wasn't of interest at the time, and I understand the situation's different now, but do we know what direction, or is it something that council would just be kind of coming up with what we think is best?
Well, we could take just your ideas tonight and formulate something. And again, there's a lot of practice out there to pull from to put something together, and we could do that quickly. I think in the beginning phase of this, folks were looking at the large sums of money being discussed by the federal level, which is far more than the $5,000 grant. But sure, things have changed. A lot of folks are still in business, which is great, but they're still struggling, have taken on a lot of expenses related to COVID. We've generally heard that any amount of support would be welcomed, and I think the $25,000 to $5,000 grants would go a long way for a lot of businesses.
Okay. I'd be very interested in having something come back on this, especially if it had input from the business community so that we had a better idea of specifically what's being asked, specifically what would actually make a difference and be helpful. And in light of the news today that the county has now moved into the red, out of the purple and into the red, or is going to be moving in the next couple of days, but that could be in jeopardy, I'm assuming, if, as we go into winter.
Yes.
And Councilmember Addis, to be clear, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that this evening, Ms. Crawford was speaking directly to item number 2 on the agenda with regard to relief for water and sewer rates. But of course, the discussion regarding potential micro loans and/or grants is appropriate for now for this part of the agenda. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, to take on that, the grants are going to be your opportunity to help businesses, whether it's water or other COVID things at this point. We'll get into that discussion at the next item, but grants will help businesses across the board, in terms of all the expenses they're experiencing at this time.
That's really it. I think the rest of my colleagues on council asked a number of detailed questions before it got to me. So thank you for that. And I'd be very interested in knowing how we can help more.
Thank you, Councilmember. To summarize, I want to just again thank staff for the comprehensive overview and presentation. As always, very succinct and helpful. In one way, I'm glad to hear that the situation is not as dire as we originally thought. However, still, markedly extreme. I am concerned about the ability to maintain core safety services in this community, given the impacts of COVID-19. I was concerned as an individual with regard to our overall 10-year plan and status of finances in the community, even prior to the pandemic hitting and causing the extensive damage to our finances that it has caused. And so with that, I appreciate the actions that were taken very quickly. I think we were the first city to react, to declare an emergency, and I applaud staff for moving to gain concessions, and I appreciate our employee groups that have made concessions on their salaries. I appreciate the management staff for the concessions that you have made in senior leadership, and I appreciate the council members that have given up their stipends and the majority that continue to do that at present. It's apparent to me that given the fact that the city has no ability to fund a future capital budget for general fund and or the harbor fund, that we are not only facing an operational reserve depletion issue, but we're also facing an issue that's going to impact us significantly in the future, and that is having no capital funds for replacement of major capital items, and that continues to be a major concern of mine. I am convinced that from the federal and or state level, that there's going to be minimal to no continued reimbursements for general fund losses to cities without new legislation that is unlikely to significantly, in my mind, replenish the depletion of reserves that we are seeing. We must, in my opinion, preserve core staffing in our essential areas of public safety. I'm very alarmed at the numbers given by our police chief with regard to the officer ratio per thousand and the impact that could have on the community. And I'll close by saying, without a significant infusion of new revenue dollars quickly to this city, we are going to face decisions that will impact public safety very soon. And so I also wanted to just add my support to assisting our business community and talking to a number of them. They are hurting. They have incurred increased costs due to COVID-19 and diminished revenue supply because of the inability to deliver full service. And so I would support having something come back to council, perhaps at the next meeting, that could detail a program of either microloan and or grant assistance on the part of the city. So that's my summary, and I'll just open it up. Any other council members wish to add to that with regard to direction?
I would add to that just slightly. First of all, I concur with everything that you have said so far, Mr. Mayor. I also would support having something come back, and I think with the understanding that it's going to come from the Economic Development Fund, the loans and or grants. And I would like to see, my further comment would be that I think it should be competitive. I don't believe it should be first come, first serve, and we should have some criteria so that we're making sure we get the money to the folks that need it the most. I also just wanted to add that I fully appreciate this report, and I appreciate the fact that our finance director is very conservative. And it's important for us to know and to note that we have always balanced our budget as a city here, and that we have put into place excellent financial policies, thanks to Ms. Calloway, that have allowed us to weather this storm as well as we have. So I want to thank her, and I appreciate the fact that she's conservative in her estimates, because it's helped us in the long run. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Heller, any comments, closing comments, sir?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Davis, sir.
I just want to echo the doing some research into business grants and ask Mr. Collins if he has enough direction at this point to pursue that.
Yes, plenty of direction. We will get back at the latest, the next council meeting, and potentially a special meeting if we can pull it off.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Addis, any closing comments? Councilmember Addis?
Maybe experience.
I just want to I'm here.
No, go ahead.
I just want to reiterate my gratitude to staff for the cuts that they've already gone through. I think that, it's easy to talk about the city budget as if it's a kind of an ethereal thing or a third party, but at the end of the day, these cuts are about actual people and their livelihoods. And I think it's incredibly noble the way that staff stepped out in front of this to take cuts themselves first before looking at the rest of this and how else we need to address it. And of course, I echo the sentiments about, wanting to do economic development and having a focus there. And I think it's critically important that we raise revenue, but I just really want to recognize everything that's been done to this point, because I do believe it's put staff in a hard position, and they've weathered that storm really for the good of our community, and I appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilmember. Appreciate that too. And with that, that'll move us to item number 2 of the special meeting. Just a note, AGP requires about a 10-minute transition, so we will have a hard stop at 5:20, which gives us about 28 minutes. With that, I will turn item number 2 over to Mr. Collins and Ms. Callaway regarding the water and sewer rate review. Thank you.
Yes, Mayor, council members, thank you so much. I am going to turn it over to Ms. Callaway, but just to lead it off, we have a policy that requires us to review the wharf rate surcharge on an annual basis to understand if there's opportunities to collect less than the authorized amount established by the Prop 218 process in 2018. Ms. Callaway will give an update as where we are on that financial analysis, as well as recommendations to enhance and expand the utility discount programs to the residential ratepayers. Thanks.
Thank you, and I'll try to keep my comments fairly brief so there's time for discussion and direction from the council in order to meet the hard deadline. But in 2018, we adopted the wharf rate surcharge policy, and that's attached to the staff report for your reference. And that's specifically regarding the surcharge component of our water and sewer rates. And the idea being that when financing was secured for the project, and as the project design was fleshed out more, there may be capacity to collect less than the authorized amount. So we were supposed to do that in accordance with our budget process. And as we all know, budget process looked a little bit different this year because of COVID. So we are bringing that forward to the council now, not quite in the format that we had intended in 2018 when this was adopted, but in the form that you have before you. So for the year, for our wharf surcharge and our water fund, we collected a $1.5 million, almost $1.6 million for the surcharge component, and about $2.2 million for the sewer component. We collect those rates, they go into the operating accounts for water and sewer respectively. And as our year end closes, we'll be transferring those to our WIFIA reserve accounts, because that money is intended to go towards debt service payment on the wharf. So we'll keep that as a holding spot for the funds until we start making that debt service payment. And it'll also help to be very clear about how much was collected for the surcharge in the future years, and it'll be really easy to pull out. There are some significant components to the project that we don't have finalized yet, that being our SRF funding. We expect to have that finalized by the end of the year. And then our pipeline project as well, the final contract for that. And those are two pretty significant pieces of the wharf project. So absent having those finalized and those pieces in place, we don't feel that we can recommend a rate reduction at this time. We will be revisiting this again with our budget process, which is actually just a few short months away, so it won't be that long of a wait. However, we do realize that with COVID continuing to linger on, people are experiencing a lot of challenges and difficulties financially. I wanted to be cognizant of that. We had heard in our previous discussion a few months ago that the 10% utility discount that we always offer and continue to offer really isn't enough during this period of time, specifically with the challenges of COVID. So we have brought forward a plan or an option for council to consider to expand upon our current utility discount program to help out those most in need. The recommendation is to provide a 25% discount through the June 2021 billing cycle. So that will take us through the end of this fiscal year. And it will be for those that are already on our utility discount program, as well as anybody that applies to be on it. And to apply for that, you need to demonstrate that you're eligible for the PG&E CARES program or the equivalent in SoCalGas. Also, back in April, we expanded the utility discount program to include those that had been laid off due to COVID or have had to shutter their businesses due to COVID. So we do have a few people that are enrolled under those circumstances. That technically ended in June. That was how long we ran that program through. So we're asking to carry that program on until next June as well, with those qualifying criteria, and expand that amount to 25%. The council also adopted a utility rebate program, and that rebate program is specifically for members of our mobile home parks and apartment complexes that are not individually metered. The rebate for that program was $150 a year or $12.50 a month. In order to be consistent, we're recommending to increase that to $15 per month or $180 per year. Again, this is a temporary increase through June to reflect the hardships of COVID. There is sufficient fund balance in our utility discount fund that's funded through donations and fees and penalties. So there's sufficient fund balance to cover what we anticipate the cost of this to be with the current number of enrollees, and expecting to maybe receive a few more. So we're not worried about having the funds available to cover that for the next few months as recommended. Would note that the intention is to go back to the 10% discount and $150 rebate beginning with the next fiscal year. So this isn't an ongoing recommendation. It would be short term to help with COVID. And also we'll be doing a rate review again with the budget process. And at that time, if the other components of this project are finalized, we can have a discussion about a rate reduction possibility or other options for council to consider. And then with that, I'll leave it for questions and discussion with council.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Scott. Council, let's go ahead and combine any questions and any summary comments you'd like to make. Councilmember Davis, would you like to start us off, sir?
Yes, I want to first say another thank you to Jennifer Calloway for making the utility rebate program possible to our mobile home parks and apartment residents. That was an idea that came from the public, and we didn't know how to do it. And Jennifer, of course, knew how to do it and made it happen. I would just say that I support both recommendations and both resolutions.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. Councilmember Heller, sir.
Yes, I agree with Councilmember Davis's comments, and I would like to thank all staff, everybody who's on this call, as well as all your support folks, for really a remarkable job what you've done over the last few months to deal with an extremely difficult situation. And I just think you have done and continue to do a really outstanding job. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jeff, for those positive comments. And Councilmember McPherson.
Yes, thank you. I also support both of the resolutions. And I just want to, I know that Ms. Calloway did make this statement as to how the program is funded, but I just wanted to clarify again for anybody watching that it's not paid through the user rates. It actually is paid through contributions and late fees. And I also wanted to say that I think it's very prudent that we're waiting, even though I know that we have talked about hopefully not collecting all of the surcharge every month, but I think that the recommendation to wait until those other parts of the WRF project are settled is a prudent one. So I agree with it.
Thank you. Councilmember Addis.
Yeah, I'm super supportive. I appreciate staff for doing this, as well as the folks who have donated to this. So I'm all in on these two. I think it'll help the people of Morro Bay.
Great. Thank you all for those comments. I too support the recommendation in the staff report, and I'll go ahead and make the motion. I recommend that the council adopt resolution number 83-20, extending the temporary Morro Bay Cares COVID-19 utility discount program through the June 2021 billing cycle, and increasing the discount rate for all enrolled utility discount program customers to 25% of the approved rates for fiscal year 2020-2021, and resolution number 84-20, increasing the utility rebate program to $15 per month or $180 per year through the June 2021 billing cycle to eligible members of mobile home parks and apartments.
I second that.
Motion by Mayor Heading for staff recommendation, seconded by Councilmember Davis. And we will do a roll call vote, please.
Mayor Heading.
Yes.
Councilmember Davis.
Yes.
Councilmember Addis.
Yes.
Councilmember Heller.
Yes.
And Councilmember McPherson.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you all for being at this special meeting. Thank you again, staff, for your excellent reports and excellent work. We appreciate it very much. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. The next regular meeting of the Morro Bay City Council will be today, Tuesday, September 22nd at 5:30 p.m., approximately 28 minutes from now. It will be held via teleconference. We'll see you then. Thank you.